really helping to put this on. It's really, I'm very excited about it. I'm glad that you are all here. Um, really grateful for this opportunity. And let's see, I'm going to share my screen and get this thing going. So we're on chapter 6 today, and chapter 7, sorry. And this chapter is titled "The Great Reality," which is a statement from Bill Wilson in the Big Book. And yeah, so just to kind of reiterate, this obviously isn't a 12-step meeting, and it's not a great replacement for the steps either. And my book also isn't necessarily a good replacement for the steps. I would recommend doing the steps first, because that really is the miracle, right? That gets us to this point. Um, and so, yeah, we call this shadow work, and while we're not doing like a hands-on workshop per se, I think we do end up doing some shadow work just through the nature of kind of what we encounter throughout the readings and throughout the book. We're taking a journey inward, right? That's the whole emphasis really, is that we're shifting from this sort of extroverted point of view, and we're turning and going in. Remember that the word psyche in Greek means soul, right? And so soul searching is like searching one's psyche, right? And as we go, especially this the title of this chapter, "The Great Reality," really is kind of a reference in my mind to what Jung would call the objective psyche, right? Which is the collective unconscious, kind of that part of our psychology, of our the human mind that we can't actually see or are conscious of with the ego, but that we can sense is there by doing this work. Obviously, this is the text that we're going through, "The Shadow of a Figure of Light." This is my website. It's cody-peterson.com. You can get books there. Also, I do post these uh, videos of these lessons up there to the website. There's other videos up there as well. So yeah, and if you want to join the WhatsApp group, I know they're posting links to it. It's kind of fun. There's some good conversation in there, and we'd love to have you. So jumping right in. Um, the last chapter we ended with, we were talking about the difference between the psychological approach, and which is sort of that underlying uniting factor in 12-step spirituality, right? Which is the God as we understand him. And that psychological approach stands in contrast to what is typically understood is like the conventional Western approach, or what Jung calls the metaphysical approach, right? Which is, by metaphysical, what he means is that these God images, these gods, are actually metaphysical beings somewhere else, perhaps in the universe or wherever. But then they're things that exist outside of us rather than inside of us, right? That's metaphysical. We so and what we encountered last, in the closing of last session, was Jung's phrase about God as being a subjectively conditioned concept. And I wanted to touch back on that and read the letter where I got that from, in the book. So, and this is the letter. So he had written this, I think, in 1957, and he was writing it to, actually, I think, a Martin Buber, who was, they kind of had this ongoing dialogue as far as I remember, and they would sort of argue. I don't know if it was Buber or someone else, but Jung would always respond to these people, because they very often were really the religious people tended to be highly critical of Carl Jung's position. And this is what that letter says. "My human limitation does not permit me to assert that I know God. Hence, I cannot but regard all assertions about God as relative, because subjectively conditioned. And this out of respect for my brothers, whose other conceptions and beliefs have as much to justify them as mine. If I am a psychologist, I shall try to take these differences seriously and to understand them. But under no circumstance shall I assume that if the other person doesn't share my opinion, it is due to a deformity or lack of an organ, like a small brain or something. How could I have any communication at all with the person if I approached him with the absolutist claims of the believer?" And so there we go. That's really where Jung's kind of mentioning this idea of the subjectively conditioned God. And what that means, I think, in 12-step jargon, especially for the people who are practicing in Alcoholics Anonymous, is Bill. It reminds us of Bill Wilson's phrase that we used an inadequate conception of God, right? So God is a relative construct. And it can be actually an inadequate construct. It doesn't have to be this absolute thing. So we're going to dig into that a little more as we go. So this leads us back to this fundamental concept that emerged in part 2 of the book, right? Which is the transformation of the God image. And see, because when we understand that the God image is a relative construct, then that means it's dynamic, right? So that it can actually change and morph and grow. That's what we refer to when we say the transformation of the God image. So and so this picture right here, I really like this picture. I just came across it like last week or 2 weeks ago. So this picture kind of depicts the transformation of the God image. And it sort of tells about just psychospiritual transformation in general. So I'm just going to really quickly describe this. So first of all, on the 4 corners, we have kind of the angels and there's like a cow with wings and the blackbird. Those represent the 4 gospels, okay? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then in the top half is the Trinity, okay? So there's the Holy Ghost as the dove, then there's God the Father, and then there's another God that's supposedly the Son, right? So that's the Trinity. But what's happening there is I think I don't know if it's the Son or the Father, but one of them is putting a crown on a female divinity. That's Mary. Okay. Now this depiction predates the Assumption of Mary in the Catholic Church by like hundreds of years. But and Jung tells us that the Assumption actually came out of sort of this the mass, like the Catholic Church masses kind of demanded it, but that there was a psychological need for a feminization of the Godhead, right? And so that kind of takes place here. So what's happening at the same time in the lower half of this drawing is what you can see there is there's another sort of being like an angel or something that's pulling this strange creature out of a lump of matter, right? And that right there, that creature is actually that's the trickster, or they call it Mercurius, but it's really just a symbol of the transformed individual, right? That's sort of the guy that's done the 12 steps, right? That's the process of this rebirth. And so the thing to notice here is that as the God image is changing, at the same time, the person is undergoing this psychological or this psycho-spiritual development, right? Those things happen in conjunction. So this is what Edward Edinger says about this picture. He says, this picture illustrates from 2 levels simultaneously the process of the transformation of God, the essential meaning of the alchemical process of transformation. The prima materia, which is the lump of clay, was to undergo transformation. Process was identified with God. So essentially what I just explained, right? That as Mercurius emerges out of that lump of clay, the God image itself is transformed, right? And becomes more complete. So in later chapters, we're going to talk about the God image and how the conventional God image in Western thinking is actually an incomplete God image, right? Because it's so perfect. It's like this perfect, it's this figure of light, right? But Jung tells us that one does not attain enlightenment by imagining figures of light. Rather, it happens when we make the darkness conscious. And so that's also depicted in this plaque, because the Mercurius, the birth of that image is actually, it's that prima materia, that clump of clay becoming conscious. Now, Joseph Campbell, and I have this quote in the book. He explains why a fixed conception of the God image, right? When I say fixed, that means it's static, right? Like it doesn't change, right? So why a fixed conception basically inhibits our progress as we try to, attain this spiritual transformation. And this is what Campbell says. Symbols are the catalysts of the numinous, and therein lies the secret of their force. However, the traits of symbols and elements of myth tend to acquire a power of their own through association, by which access of the numinous itself may become blocked. And it does indeed become blocked when the images are insisted upon as final terms in themselves, as they are, for example, in a dogmatic credo. And so what he's saying here is that symbols, so we're going to talk about numinous, right? What is numinosity? What is this numinous power? But it's this power, right? The symbols are the catalyst of this life transforming power. But when the symbols become final terms, then they lose that power, right? And if you're paying attention, you probably recognize that, like in Bill Wilson's mind, like he had this conception of this, the czar of heaven, but that he couldn't find the power that he needed by trying to access it. And that was my story. For a long time, I tried to sort of access this old God image that I had, right? Wilson calls them the God images of our youth. And it just didn't work. Like, I could plea and pray and beg and go to church and sacrifice and do everything I could, but somehow the connection wasn't there, and I didn't have access to the numinous, to the numinosity, right? So this is what I say in the book. Campbell's way of thinking is especially relevant regarding our new approach to the Western God image. Within the context of certain religious dogmas, the czar of heaven represents an objective statement of fact, what Campbell calls a final term and a known stranger to the human psyche, because it's out there. Conversely, the arguably more inspiring and sophisticated approach to the God image is purely psychological, interpreting that fundamental symbol as evocative of our longing for deeper connection to each other and to the universe, as well as to the power that makes such connections possible. Jung explained, God is a primordial experience of man, and from the remotest times, humanity has taken inconceivable pains either to portray this baffling experience, to assimilate it by means of interpretation, speculation, and dogma, or else to deny it. And while the symbol of God is meant to evoke such a primordial experience, its power to do so becomes blurred when we hold it to be a somatic being somewhere else other than right here and now in the soul of humankind, where and when we need it most. Now, to understand what it means, right? So Jung says that that God is a primordial experience, right? So, and that experience is also what we could call the experience of the numinosum, right? And to experience the numinosum, we're going to kind of turn back to the conversation we've been having, that is about the reductive versus the archetypal or synthetic approach to sort of this process or this journey that we're on. And so I'm going to read this. This is from Edward Edinger. He says, this really expresses in a nutshell the synthetic aspect of Jungian analysis. There is also the reductive aspect of analysis on the one hand and synthesis on the other. When we're dealing with psychological synthesis, we're dealing with the process that brings into awareness the presence of the numen and the lumen, the numinous energy of the archetypal image, and the light, consciousness, the insight that glows out of it. So Jung explained this, that archetypes, like that these symbols, actually, they have a life of their own, okay? That they exist in the psyche, and there's sort of evidence, I guess, to suggest that these archetypes have sort of a consciousness of their own, and they sort of interact with one another behind the veil of our consciousness. And what Edinger is saying here is that when we become conscious of these archetypes, then what happens is that we actually sort of absorb their consciousness, right? So, and that makes us grow and become more and more conscious. So and I'm going to explain why this matters in a few minutes in terms of Alcoholics Anonymous, but essentially, when we synthesize these archetypes, their radiance becomes part of our consciousness, their luminosity becomes part of our experience, and it makes us smarter. So Edinger says, unconscious complexes almost always have at their core an archetypal image. They have a certain consciousness of their own, as the complex is assimilated, the latent consciousness is extracted from the complex. So again, that's that Mercurius image being pulled out of that lump of clay. But in terms of the archetype of the alcoholic, as we become more and more conscious of alcoholism as a spiritual quest, then what's actually happening is that we're seeing the complex of alcoholism as an archetype, right? I named it the archetype of the alcoholic, which I'm not sure that anyone else had, but the point is that once we understand the complex as an archetype, it's no longer a complex. And that's when we absorb its energy. We actually absorb its power and we can use it for transformation. So, and this is Edinger again. Jung said that he had never seen a patient past the age of 35 who was cured without finding a religious attitude towards life. A religious attitude understood psychologically is based on experience of the numinosum, i.e. the self. But it is impossible for the ego to experience the self as something separate as long as it is unconsciously identified with the self. In other words, if we're playing God, we're not going to be able to experience God. This explains the need for the alienation experience as a prelude to the religious experience, meaning the deflation of the ego at depth. The ego must first be disidentified with the self before the self can be encountered as the other. As long as one unconsciously identifies with God, he cannot experience God's existence. And I just think it's really crazy that these really deep thinking psychologists, these Jungian analysts, I mean, Edinger is just super prolific, you know, and he's describing this experience in these super scientific terms, right? But it's something that here in the 12 steps, we just sort of almost take for granted, right? Like that's kind of just like a wordy way of saying everything that Wilson says on page 63, right? That we had to quit playing God. It didn't work. So symbols then become the gateway to the numinous, and they're sort of they're like expressions that the ego kind of drums up, I guess, in order to explain this primordial experience. So right here in the book is where I delve into what the word symbol actually means. This is Edinger again. He says the word symbol derives from the Greek word symbolon, which combines two root words, sim, meaning together or with, and bolon, meaning that which has been thrown. So like the word parabola is a similar thing. It's to throw. The basic meaning of symbol is thus that which has been thrown together. In original Greek usage, symbols referred to the two halves of an object, such as a stick or a coin, which two parties broke between them as a pledge and to prove later the identity of the presenter of the one part to the holder of the other. The term corresponded to our word tally concerning which Webster's unabridged dictionary states, it was customary for traders after notching a stick to show the number of quantity of goods delivered, to split it lengthwise through the notches so that the parts exactly corresponded, the seller keeping one stick and the purchaser the other. A symbol was thus originally a tally referring to the missing piece of an object, which when restored to or thrown together with its partner, recreated the original whole object. This corresponds to our understanding of the psychological function of a symbol. The symbol leads us to the missing part of the whole man. It relates us to our original totality. It heals our split, our alienation from life. And since the whole man is a great deal more than the ego, it relates us to the suprapersonal forces, which are the source of our being and our meaning. This is the reason for honoring subjectivity and cultivating the symbolic life. Now, essentially what he's saying here is that the word symbol meant to break apart or to bring together, while the word, and this is in contrast to the word diabolical, which actually means to throw apart, right? So the process, like psychologically speaking, is the devil is the symbol of the split, right? Where the symbol then is the process of bringing the split back together, right? And as Edinger says, it leads us to the missing parts of the whole man and it relates us to our original totality. So basically what I say in the book then is that once we begin this internal pilgrimage, okay, and and we encounter the symbol of God, right? Like that's the first thing that happens when we start to transform. And especially like in the 12 steps, right? But the thing we run up against in that moment when we sort of behold the God image, right, in our psyche, is that we're also confronted with our own brokenness, right? And this is a very old idea which stems from the basically the fall of Adam and Eve, right? Which is kind of the foundation of the Western psychology, right? That since the fall, not a single person on earth has been worthy of God's presence. And so we sort of all adopt that, just it's inherent in our psyche. And so myth then becomes the story of our quest to get back into the garden, to get back into God's presence, to have that brokenness restored, right? Um, so and this means that each of us bears a primordial wound that's symbolized by what takes place in the garden. For me, the wound is I am unworthy, right? I'm unworthy. And this often shows up like in my relationships as she is mad at me, right? But it's just this kind of really quiet underlying belief that I have that really colors my approach and my perspective of everything in life. Um, while religious symbols are meant to heal that primordial split in the psyche, as we learn when we take the steps, we can't be made whole until we become conscious of the fact that at some point we were separated from that which we now unconsciously long for. However, uncovering the evidence of such a split isn't so easy. Even those of us who suffer from the level of delusion that defines alcoholism or addiction have a hard time coming to terms with the glaring truth about it. Ironically, we find the proof of what is missing scattered among the broken pieces of our lives. Our need for spiritual help is only ever exposed through a psychic fracture that befalls us at the very moment all hope is lost, when there is no friendly direction, as the late Clancy I, perhaps the most renowned AA speaker, often said. That's why hitting bottom turns out to be our greatest blessing, for it ushers in an attitude best described by the 12-step acronym GOD, the gift of desperation. Indeed, one of the great paradoxes of the journey towards authentic spirituality is that it sprouts out of the very moment we feel the most alienated from our source. Before we are led back to the missing parts of ourselves, as Edinger suggested, before we can be made whole through the power discovered in the religious imagery presented in steps 2 and 3, we must accept the harsh reality implied by step 1. Thankfully, by the time we had fully conceded to our innermost selves that we were alcoholic, we had already made huge strides towards cultivating the type of self-searching required for a restoration to take place. And isn't that true, right? Because, you know, so much of this program and this process, it really boils down to our willingness. And I think if a person really like fully takes step 1, then they're already essentially well on their way to completing the steps, right? And but what's happened there is that they've really come to terms with the fact that they're absolutely broken, that they don't have a way out. They can't think their way out of this problem. The real problem with Western metaphysics, which I titled this section with that, and I think it's pretty telling. So again, when we compare the psychological approach to the metaphysical approach, we kind of encounter this strange psychological feedback loop, which I stumbled upon when I was writing this, and I just found it completely fascinating, right? And basically what it is that our ability to accept our own brokenness is very often hindered by our tendency to project our religious images into the world out there, right? So that what's really taking place here is that the way I conceive of the symbols, like especially like the symbol of God, is very reflective of the way I understand my own relationship to my own problems. Um, and so, um, so if we think the symbol exists outside of ourselves, then most likely we're going to think that the problem also exists outside of ourselves. And which I just think is crazy, right? Because if God is outside, then the devil is outside of us too, right? And so this is how Jung describes this. He says an exclusively religious projection may rob the soul of its values, so that through sheer inanition, it becomes incapable of further development and gets stuck in an unconscious state. At the same time, this person falls victim to the delusion that the cause of all misfortune lies outside, and people no longer stop to ask themselves how far it is they're doing. If the soul no longer has any part to play, religious life congeals into externals and formalities. It may easily happen, therefore, that a Christian who believes in all the sacred figures is still undeveloped and unchanged in his inmost soul, because he has all God outside and does not experience God in the soul. His deciding motives, his ruling interests and impulses do not spring from the sphere of Christianity, but from the unconscious and undeveloped psyche, which is as pagan and archaic as ever. Not the individual alone, but the sum total of individuals living in a nation proves the truth of this contention. And that's a direct commentary on Germany, on Nazi Germany. Jung often spoke of like how entire nations can be completely unconscious, and that look at all the destruction that comes to the earth in general when this happens. So, but we see this on a more personal level as well, right? And it's interesting to me that the steps are placed in an order 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, right? But that very often they tend to happen, at the same time. What Jung says right here is that he basically says it at the same time they fall victim to the delusion. So basically, and this is what I say in the book right after this, that Jung learned early on from watching his own father, devout pastor of the Swiss Reformed Church, that it is not uncommon for a person to believe in all of the externalized images of a particular religion and yet remain fundamentally undeveloped and unchanged inwardly. On the other hand, the more open-minded we are regarding our own spiritual beliefs, the more capable we will become in seeing the truth about ourselves. Whereas an all-outside God concept makes the already difficult task of spiritual growth all but impossible, for it cuts off one's access to the symbol's numinosity. And again, this is my experience. I mean, I can't argue with this experience. Perhaps somebody out there has a different experience than this, and it would be interesting to see that. But for me, the real much deeper growth only started happening once I was able to wrestle with this and to understand this concept. A religious attitude which fancies God as an external object of worship mirrors the delusion that each of us suffers from time to time, that something or someone outside of ourselves has the power to fix us, perhaps the most glaring symptom of spiritual malady. So what I'm saying here is that the all God outside concept is essentially the same as the idea that the next drink will be the one that makes me feel whole, right? We're still projecting the solution outside of ourselves. Psychological transformation is again, it's based on the transformation of the God image. So, and that sounds like this really kind of strange esoteric idea. But what I found is that many of these Jungianisms, which seem on the outside like that require, a PhD to understand, actually come naturally to people that are in the 12 steps, because this is what our experience has been, right? And this makes us some of the luckiest people in the world. Bill, in Bill's story, he describes the transformation of the God image, and it's a really simple process, right? Essentially what Bill says is that his conception shifted from the czar of heaven, right, to, which is Campbell's, God as a final term, that the God image shifts then into what Bill would later call God consciousness, or an unsuspected inner resource. And I think it's really good to point this out, Bill said, this is what Bill says in We Agnostics, right? And sometimes people will say that that in this process we don't ever find the God image, right? We just search. But that's not what Bill said. He said deep down in every man, woman, and child is the fundamental idea of God. It may be obscured by calamity, by pomp, by worship of other things, but in some form or other is there for faith in a power greater than ourselves, and miraculous demonstrations of that power in human lives are a fact as old as man himself. We finally saw that faith in some kind of a God was part of our makeup just as much as the feeling we have for a friend. Sometimes we had to search fearlessly, but he was there. He was as much a fact as we were. We found the great reality deep down within us. In the last analysis, it is only there that he may be found. It was so with us. We can only clear the ground a bit. If our testimony helps sweep away prejudice, enables you to think honestly, encourages you to search diligently within yourself, then, if you wish, you can join us on the broad highway. With this attitude, you cannot fail. The consciousness of your belief is sure to come to you. And so what happens here then is that Wilson sort of introduces the antidote to this age-old Western problem of the all God outside conception, right? Which is the reason that essentially, if I understand Jung and Joseph Campbell correctly, the reason that we can't access the numinosity through religious conceptions is because of the all God outside conception. This is what I write. Having worked with scores of newcomers to the fledgling fellowship, by the time he wrote the big book, Bill recognized that it is nearly impossible for most people to believe that anything good exists within, let alone the omnipotent God. But his intuition allowed him to sense, like Jung, that the God image is in fact an aspect of our very being, a baseline component deep in the unconscious psyche of every man, woman, and child. And yet, if God really does dwell in the human soul, it's a place most of us wouldn't dare look, even if we knew how. Turning inward is usually our last resort, but doing so paves the way to seeing who we really are, to discovering the great reality, what Jung calls the objective psyche, another term for his notion of collective unconscious. And so this is the thing then, right? Is when we're projecting the images as well as the problem to something outside of ourselves, then it prohibits us to seeing the reality of the situation. It prohibits us from being able to view the world through an objective perspective or through the objective psyche. Once we understand that the problem exists within, and we also start looking for the spiritual solution within, that's what opens the door to this whole journey that we're on right now. And I think the one that Bill Wilson laid out in the book Alcoholics Anonymous. So the great reality is the objective psyche. And this is essentially an objective view of ourselves, and it coincides with our subjective view of the higher power. Here, Wilson's myth underscores the antidote to the spiritual condition that now plagues a culture defined by materialism, the belief that everything good lies outside. By replacing the image of the Tsar of Heaven with a psychologically based concept, which is what most of us do, Wilson opened himself up to the recognition that his troubles were of his own making, that they arose out of himself. The more we align ourselves with the notion of God as a subjective power, as suggested in steps 2 and 3, the more empowered we become in the fearless and searching self-appraisal suggested in steps 4 through 10. Thus, by addressing our natural tendency as Westerners to view the God image as a final term, the 12-step myth engenders within us the wherewithal to solve many of our own problems, for by accepting ourselves as the root cause of our problems, we quit looking outside of ourselves for something to fix us, including our notion of the God image. And so, even though we may not be aware of it, we're essentially kind of in line with this Jungian perspective, right? Of trying to see ourselves through the eyes of the great reality, and that the more subjectively we can understand the God image, right? The higher power in steps 2 and 3, then the more honestly we're going to be able to examine ourselves in steps 4 and 5. And that equation right there is really a fascinating one. And I think it's interesting that it's something that Jung himself had also noticed. I don't think Bill Wilson understood this stuff consciously, right? But I think that he was inspired to depict it this way because he was. This goes back to the conversation I had with Shaberg, right? Is that Bill, the fact that he was writing about his own experience and that he was so well connected to his own psyche, it allowed him to express these things in this way that is really sort of aligns with scientific truth. Carl Jung was a scientist. He was an empirical scientist. He tried to prove these things through different methods, and so it makes sense that Wilson's kind of his myth or his process aligns with that. That's why it's so effective. And then we're just kind of wrapping this up. It's important to understand that for centuries, these concepts were blasphemy, right? Like that God was a relative construct would get you killed 200 or 300 years ago, maybe even more recently. Today, so even still, right? Many ministers of faith hold the God image to be a static being. I mean, it's interesting when you talk to people. In like my editor is she's a Christian lady and she goes to church and stuff. And so when I was writing this, her and I would go back and forth about this a lot because I was saying that conventional religion holds the God image to be this, right? This metaphysical conception. And so she sent me different articles and studies and stuff that show that it's not necessarily the case. But then when I asked her if the ministers of her church would consider God as a symbol, as only a symbol, as not a being somewhere else, she said, I don't know, I don't think so, right? So even if people are open-minded to the idea that God could be that God isn't necessarily like a being somewhere else, like still fundamentally to overlook the fact that God is a symbol of something, then I think is to sort of still be entrapped by Western metaphysics. So this is what I write. Typically, ministers of Western religion reject the idea that the great reality can only be found in the dark recesses of each individual's psyche. Yet, from the psychological perspective, the extroverted style of worship many of them preach is far more heretical, being perhaps one reason why so many have had so much difficulty taking accountability for their lives. Thus, Jung wrote in all earnestness, it would be blasphemy to assert that God can manifest himself everywhere save only in the human soul. Nonetheless, the implications of such a close arrangement between us and our gods is hard to fathom, especially if we are still entrapped by Western metaphysics. Jung goes on to explain why it is that we should endeavor to adopt a psychological approach, drawing kickback from the ministry, many of whom vehemently condemned him throughout his career. To carry a God around in yourself means a great deal, he writes. It is a guarantee of happiness, of power, and even of omnipotence, insofar as these are attributes of divinity. To carry a God within oneself is practically the same as being God oneself. And I remember hearing a talk by Chuck Chamberlain where he was basically telling the audience that they need to stop looking out elsewhere for this power, right? Because that they actually are the power. But even within like the 12-step fellowships, like this idea can ring as like blasphemy, right? Because it's like we want to make so much of a separation because we've been playing God for so long. But we really do want to consider how we can come back to this idea to really look inside, right? And yeah. And this is what I write. Thus, Jung insisted that digging through the dank soil of our own psychology for the truth about ourselves is our greatest responsibility, and that avoidance of such a task, now an unwanted byproduct of being born into Western culture, produces nothing more than a shell of a human who lacks awareness of their most glaring faults, incapable of grasping the great reality. Sadly, by insisting that God is a final term, conventional religion feeds into the delusion that we are not the cause of our troubles, thereby blocking us from any real solutions, spiritual and otherwise. But the 12 steps counter this tendency by guiding us to take full accountability of our behaviors and our lives, while at the same time instructing us on how to author our own religious beliefs, the essence of viewing oneself from the perspective of the great reality. By earnestly reckoning with the God image, which naturally leads to the adoption of a psychological approach, we counter our innate reluctance to search everywhere but inside of ourselves for anything of real meaning and value. And yeah, so that is it. That is the lesson for today. And I'll stop sharing my screen and I'll turn it back over to Duncan.
Wow. Okay, everyone, please unmute yourself and join me in a collective appreciation of thank yous, sounds, movements, interpretive dance.
Thank you so much.
Mind
Thank you
blowing.
so
Or
much.
dancing.
Wow.
Beautiful.
Thank you. Wow.
Or dancing.
Wow.
Okay.
Wow, that is really fun. I have really especially enjoyed today's presentation. Let's see, let me get to my what is going on here? I'm trapped in my screen. Okay, just a second.
That's why I was bummed to get thrown out. I missed most of it.
Oh
Oh,
no.
you're back, Despina. Good.
Okay. All right, just a moment here. Let's do this and this. And now we'll move to the question and answer session. This is a time we'll open up for questions and answers. Each person will have about 1 minute to reflect or ask a question. Dave is not here today to prompt you off the stage with that music that they play at the Oscars. So I'll just wave my watch around after you've been asking your question for about 1 minute, and if you would wrap up, and Cody will do his best to answer your questions. If you don't want to be recorded, please send your question to me in the chat. I will watch for your questions in the chat and weave those in to the Q&A session. And I will be asking people to unmute for questions. Yeah, Shayna, you're the first, I see.
Hi, thank you.
And you are muted again. Let's try that again.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Wow, such a grateful member of this program and to be here on this reading. Something that came up was in the discussion of symbolism and the God being separate. Like, I love the question that you proposed to your the person, like, is God outside? Like, could God be a symbol and then, it void of like this omnipresent like figure that we see, and tying that back in within. I just love everything about this discussion. I'm just so on board. But I was thinking through the context of the 12 steps, like how we go through them and we don't have an actual like symbol to hold on to. And so wondering in that, like, if because we have our spiritual awakening in step 12, is it because there's void of symbolism? Like, just wondering how you kind of see that connection with our own program.
Yeah. No, that's a great question. I think that that is what makes the steps so effective, is that they don't have this sort of defined conception that everyone has to adhere to. That, and even more than that, it's like, what, the going back to the concept of like the relative God image, right? Is that we can even say that God is no more than a group of drunks, right? That God manifests himself in our group conscience, as in tradition number 2, which actually for me, when I got sober, was the way I had to conceive of God, because I had so much, like, just so many ideas about what the higher power was or had to be, or what a spiritual experience actually looked like. Somehow I had this intuitive sense that if I wasn't going, if I insisted on hanging on to my old ideas, I wouldn't be able to really attain sobriety, because there wasn't any movement in me, right? So I think that the fact that in the 12 steps, the conception is so utterly subjective, that's what actually makes the steps work. I do want to point out too that, when we talk about the higher power and when we talk about God, those are symbols. Those are it. So the symbols are still here, but they're more implicitly symbolic in the 12 steps, right? Versus that if you go to like a religion, then they don't want to talk about it as a symbol, because somehow that's offensive to this dogma that they have. It's not a symbol. This is real, is what they will say, right? So that's the key difference. We don't call it a symbol here either, but we're also not offended by the idea. So, and again, even if we don't have to be perfectly conscious of these processes for them to work, obviously, because most of us aren't. We just go through this process and it works. And this sort of proves even more, I think, Jung's, his hypotheses about psychological transformation is we have millions of examples here that show that it actually works in a pragmatic, real life context. Thanks for the question.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Duncan. Cody, thanks for a great lecture. I really enjoyed that, as I am enjoying the book also. Okay, my question, some reading I've done in the past, a quest for a moral compass. So given the talk today, going back as far as we can go back in human history, and there's always been a kingly class and a clergy class coming together to create symbols. And this has been a constant theme in human existence. And what, I mean, my little understanding of Jung, this organized religion really takes us away from spiritualism. So actually the question, that really we can find ourselves more as humans, understand ourselves better through understanding people like Carl Jung, through even something as the 12-step program. We can understand our spiritual side more than through organized religion. And a second question, there is a question in there, Cody. I hope you can decipher it for me. I certainly a quick question is, can you say anything on the two-headed ego? Thanks.
Sure. So let's see. Let me start with the first. So you said something early on that kings and clergy come together to create symbolism. And I wanted to comment on that because I think it's a really interesting idea. And something that I've actually thought about a lot, and something that the Jungians also explore to a great extent. And a good example of this is found in the birth of Christianity. Okay, Christianity started out as a grassroots movement. There was only a few Christians in the beginning. They weren't even Christians. There wasn't a church until Paul came around, and even then, it was a very small organization, if you could even call it that. Say, 15 to 20 people in each small little community around, and then it kind of slowly grew. But the thing that takes place in Christianity, which I think most of us don't really recognize because we're sort of so just kind of inundated with the symbol of Christ, was that when that symbol was sort of introduced to the world, that it was such a new and like exciting concept that it just grabbed their imagination, right? because God had become a human. That was a new idea. Like it may have, there may have been some other like older traditions that were kind of built around the same thing. I'm not like Mithraism and stuff. A lot of the traditions of Christianity were just carried over from previous traditions. But the symbol of Jesus like spread like wildfire. And but the symbol wasn't, I wouldn't say that I don't think it's accurate to say that it was created by like a human being just decided to like, hey, this sounds like an interesting symbol. What Jung says is that these such symbols, they sort of emerge of they're involuntary, they're autonomous. What we read earlier was that the symbols or the archetypes actually have a life of their own. So they function as autonomous organizations behind the veil of consciousness. What happens then is that humans then, like in the Christian concept, is that the church fathers, beginning with, I think it's St. Augustine, 5th or 6th century or something like that, they take this symbol and then they start to really subject it to dogmatism, right? Which in the beginning isn't so bad, because what they sort of add to the canon, and they create more and more of these interesting ideas like the Trinity and the resurrection and all this stuff. So it's not so bad, right? But when it becomes harmful is when it's no longer this sort of fluid arrangement of symbols, right? When they start to become fixed. Like this is how it is. Like so the dogma grows to a certain point, which is fine because it's still fluid, but then eventually it becomes fixed, and now it's the law. And then it's even worse. Now, if you break the law, we're going to punish you for it. And so that's where the problems come in. So in the beginning, these symbols are very effective in helping people to discover more about themselves. But as the symbols become more and more fixed, right, then they lose their numinosity. So if you look in the 12 steps, you're going to see the same thing, right? There's a certain attitude, I guess, and Wilson was aware of this. He writes about it, right? That there's these fundamentalists in AA who would actually excommunicate him if he tried to change anything in the big book. That right there is a reflection of this sort of dogmatism that becomes concretized, and that will actually tend to it diminishes the numinosity that's available. The good thing about the steps, though, is that nobody can do that to my conception of the 12 steps, right? That I get my own individual experience here, so I can remain as fluid as I want, or I can choose to adhere to the dogma as I want as well. So yeah, as far as the double-headed eagle, was that on one of the slides? So I mean, these slides were all, they come from I found they're from alchemy, like an alchemy website. They're all just really old woodcuts and paintings. They're all very, so, and I don't know what eagle you're referring to, but there's very often these creatures sort of emerge in alchemy, for example. And I can only really speculate right now on a double-headed eagle, but there's a lot to dig into for sure. But it's the eagle flies. So it's probably, it's kind of a symbol of a conjunction, a marriage of opposites. It's if the symbol means to bring together, then a double-headed eagle would probably be symbolic of two aspects of a person's being, or their consciousness, or their unconscious, or whatever, coming together. It can be any number of things. So a lot of the symbols that we saw, like I'm looking at this one right now, where it's a person holding like a shield that looks like a bullseye and an egg, but this guy has two heads and he's got a red wing and a white wing. So that's an alchemical image of the reddening, the rubido, where the process is that we go from white to red. And the red is significant of the conjunction of because white's kind of like, white as snow is, and this plays into stuff we read later, right? Is that Jesus is as a symbol, as a deity, Jesus was perfect, just absolutely white as snow, spotless, blameless. And Jung felt that that was an incomplete symbol because it doesn't properly really tell the story of what we go through as we try to transform, because we all are broken, we sin, and so what we're trying to do then is shift our own conception from this sort of picturesque, beautiful, white as snow to a more complete conception of the God image, right? And remember, the transformation of the God image is also the transformation of the human psyche. Those two things happen in tandem. So the more we can recognize the God image as being perhaps good and bad, then the more inclined we will be, like just in our own psyche, to transform. So anyways, kind of a rambly answer, but as they say, I hope that helps. Thanks for the question. I love it.
Yeah, brilliant. I love the presentation today because it was so focused on exploring, what is God and what works, what doesn't work. I remember back to my early recovery. First thing I did was look back at my own religious background and start exploring other religious traditional offerings in the community to explore, because I want to find out what God is for, so I can get on with step 2. And, I had some experiences and so forth that weren't very satisfying. Then I started asking uh, the spirit realm to show me, what it is. Hey, show me what you are. Show me what you are. And then I started having visions in my meditations. I started having symbols that explain things to me, arriving in my dreams and in my meditational visions and so forth. And that has changed over time. And uh, my view or concept or understanding of higher power or God, what has morphed and changed over the years. So it fits right in with what you're talking about. Maybe you could comment on this in terms of what you presented today, how each individual member begins to seek inside and try to connect with the spirit realm directly, direct experience, to have that two-way communication where I go searching and something receives me and so forth. Can you speak about that?
Yeah. Yeah, that's really incredible, because that really is so I guess in my book, what I've done is I've taken Bill Wilson as a case study and I've looked at his experience through a Jungian lens. And it just so happens that Bill Wilson has a connection with Carl Jung, and that their myths sort of developed out of the same mythological rhizome. So it made for a good comparison. But what Jung says is that rather than trying to appropriate religious ideas from other cultures, it's better if we look for the same lessons within ourselves, right? And which I think is exactly what you just said, and it's also what Bill Wilson does too. um Bill just, he pulled it directly from within, right? So and I like what Edinger said. I think we read it last week, that the unconscious takes the same attitude towards the ego that the ego takes with it. And so that if we turn towards the unconscious with sort of an openness, and even like you said, like asking the unconscious to tell us what it is, what then what becomes revealed is, through dreams, through active imagination, in visions, like meditations, like images of symbols that emerge, is really like a more robust kind of understanding of what it is that wants to manifest, right? This what we're what we're really looking for here is an experience of the self, which is this sort of cohesive, um integrative experience where the ego can experience it has sort of a relationship to the unconscious, where the unconscious isn't such a menacing factor anymore, right? That it's actually becomes more of um a helpful kind of experience, where and where it's like we're not so afraid of the alcoholic mind anymore, right? That we kind of lean into what Wilson said, where God, God gave us brains to use. So, and we rely on this sort of inspiration instead of, instead of fearing it, right? Which is, I think it's fine to fear it. I mean, most of us in the 12 steps are really afraid of what the mind can actually do. We're very aware of how dangerous the psyche can actually be, right? So, yeah.
Thank you, Cody. I've got something from the chat here. I'll just read what the person wrote and see what you make out of this. And not so much a question on today's talk, but there does come a question at the end of this, okay? Have been reflecting on personal myths, like people I've seen on YouTube making a whole way of life, making their house like a forest and becoming like a fairy, setting up altars for change of seasons and ancestors, etc. Their life is so connected to their interests. I wonder if this is escape from reality, life of fantasy escape, or is this person who is so immersed and so enjoying these activities, are they following their own personal myth, i.e. God, the God image? I wonder if there is any space for others or collaboration to realize union. A personal myth is solo, yes, that we are not used to in our culture. Is digging a hobbit hole for yourself means you are individuated? Thank you.
I mean, I actually really like this question because it kind of strikes me right now specifically. And it's something that I've been wrestling with, I guess, because, like I'm writing a paper right now I'm going to try to get it published with like a journal. And it's these really kind of esoteric ideas. Like it's really similar to digging a hobbit hole and then living in it. And the question really that I have been asking myself is like, does this stuff actually mean anything, or is it just like only just garbage that I understand and that no one else will understand or appreciate? And I think that there's kind of an answer to this. Jung kind of wrestled with the same idea, and the question was like, his whole point was like, do these interpretations provide, like, do they become useful in real life, right? So like, is there evidence in my life that by studying this stuff and trying to create my own myth and write down my dreams and all this stuff, is there a reflection in real life of what I imagine that's taking place in my psyche? And so, and I actually had this conversation with Ming the other day, and I mean, and the bottom line is like, yes, there is evidence, right? There's evidence that this stuff actually works. And because the nature of our relationship is changing. And so as the psyche changes, everything on the outside should also change as well. It's hard to say whether these people on YouTube have individuated or not. If we don't know them and we don't get to interact with them, we can't say for sure. It's really, the barometer is like our own. We can only be the judges of our own character and the way we're interacting with the people around us. And if you're wondering, if the path you're on is working, you can just ask your partner or the person closest to you, how am I doing for reals? Like, is there something about myself that I don't see? That I think is a petition to the unconscious, kind of like Duncan was referring to earlier. Because again, we're sort of asking the objective psyche, like, hey, what am I not seeing here? What am I missing? So, Michelle.
Michelle, before I unmute you, I just want to say that in the Narcotics Anonymous literature, there's a passage that talks about how we are one another's eyes and ears, and that we need relation with one another and feedback from one another to be able to see ourselves more clearly. It certainly, there's information in the ACA recovery about the healing begins when we come out of isolation. We need relationships with one another in order to discover our real selves and what we'll need to work on. Michelle, let me get you unmuted there. Come on in.
Thank you. Yeah, I definitely want to plug ACA. I was on another meeting today, and in ACA, in some meetings, so not all, but in some meetings, they use the Tony A's steps, which is an interesting. Just have a look at the Tony A steps if you're not familiar. But today we reflected on this step number 10, and I'll read it. It says, we continue to take personal inventory and to love and approve of ourselves. So the ACA work comes back to like this loving and approving of ourselves. You know, in light of all of these things that I am discovering, like I am uncovering things, and it just feels so in line with this book and this work, you know, this idea of like making the shadow, you say it every time, conscious, right? And I don't know if I have a question, but I just am like, I've been thinking about, you know, just thinking of this idea of becoming a whole person. And I don't even know what that means. It just is like striking me right now where it's like, I do see myself as like fragmented. I feel like I'm not able to, like, God doesn't scratch that itch of me feeling whole. And and I've had what I think are spiritual experiences at different points of my life. But then I read the is it William James? He said that basically all religion, or all everybody's religion is there, it's basically secondhand religion. It's just somebody else's. So now I'm really thinking about that, like it's not very spiritual if I'm just like learning and regurgitating and being this, you know, and I think it's kind of like this conversation that we're having right now is that that's not a spiritual experience. The experience that I think is what could eventually bring a sense of wholeness is like this idea of like understanding, as you say, this shadow part of myself, and then still like the Tony, so the ACA goes into the and still loving yourself, like I didn't, you know, a lot of the reasons why I do that stuff is because I just do it unconsciously, right? And so now I'm trying to become more conscious. And I'll leave it at that. I don't know if there was even a question, but I'm grateful for this kind of work because it's just like looking at me, this whole person, and but still having like hope, and you know, like I'm a seeker till the grave, I think. And so your work is important for me because I feel like I get a little closer to understanding what it is I'm seeking, although I'm not sure if I'll ever find it. But anyway, thanks for keeping it interesting. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. I really appreciate what you're saying. I think that I feel like when we get those sort of clues that perhaps we're not experiencing the fullness of what we might be otherwise experience, right? Like that something feels a little off. I think that those are really some of the most important kind of blessings and times that we ever have. Because without that understanding, without that, you know, Jung says that the experience of the self is always a defeat for the ego. And so that it is important that we remain open to more information, right? And that we understand that like this, there's more work to do. There's always more work to do, right? I think that, for me, because I relate like to wondering, like, is it this path or is it this path, or like where am I going to find my own experience? And um, what I found for me was that when I started to consider the way Jung has formulated this whole process, things really, the nature of the journey started to change quite a bit. And I don't know why. I don't know why that is. Like, because I've read a lot of stuff. I've read a lot of different, traditions. I've done different meditations. I'm a seeker too, right? And so, but what I what I found in Jung was something that I don't know. It just had a little bit more depth, right? And more kind of space for me to be myself. um I love the thing about finding acceptance and this sort of wholeness, while also like really looking at the darkness, right? That's kind of the whole, I think that's the point of this journey, right? The shadow of a figure of light is that what I'm looking for actually is my own darkness. It is dark. I can't see it. It's hidden. Um, and that the experience of that darkness is really the thing that's going to change me. That chasing these figures of light and these feelings of like, oh, exaltation and like, oh, I'm, so connected. That's not always the thing, right? Like sometimes it's just getting into the darkness and the nitty gritty. Um, I hope that as we go, people become more familiar with what the shadow is, because it is a personal experience. You know what I mean? Like I have to see what my own shadow is, and I have to understand what my relationship to myself is, and all this stuff. These are all just these subjective terms that we use to really try to describe an experience that each of us has to have personally. So I'm glad you're here. I hope that like you'll stick around. I really appreciate your like just the question and everything, and the thinking about this whole process. It's great. Thank you.
Thanks, Cody. Yeah, thanks, Michelle. I agree. And I wanted to piggyback on what you were sharing about because it's so relevant for me as well. But I'll ask the question, but Cody already answered it. My question that I would put, with my own share, that's a ditto of what you were talking about, Michelle, is, I study these things and I learn all this information and I engage in this intellectual experience of trying to understand things and so forth. And I learn about different traditions and stories and how all this works and so forth. But figuring things out is not one of the steps. And that's something that keeps coming to me recently. Figuring things out is not one of the steps. It's like my story earlier, when I was going to different churches and exploring different traditions, looking for what would work for me. But then I started asking for direct contact. So yeah, I think you already answered this, Cody. I'm going to have recovery invites me to have a relationship with myself and with others, including the divine, whatever that is. And engaging in that relationship is not just an intellectual figuring things out. It's a communication. Terry, come on in.
Let me say something real quick on that.
Yeah, go ahead, Cody.
Sorry, Terry. Because I was reminded of something that one of my therapists had said, was that, it's that he wasn't going to say something ingenious to me that just blew everything open and like changed my life, right? That what actually changes us is our relationship to the other person, right? And the most important relationship we have is actually the one that we have with ourself, with the self, right? And the unconscious. And so the same way we engage with other people and we try to practice intimacy and like openness and forgiveness and try to hear and just sort of, you know, interact in those challenging ways. I think we want to do the same thing with the unconscious, which means with what are the images that I have? What are the dreams that I'm having? What do they mean, you know? And really try to take that stuff seriously and take the time to write them down and do journaling and stuff like that and just really engage with the self. Because the self is our greatest teacher for sure. Terry.
Thanks, Cody.
So such a great experience with all of you, and gets you bouncing all over the inside and the outside, right? And you know, just a few words keep just repeating themselves in me, and I think it's just such a beautiful part of becoming a little awakened, and then the words "and more will be revealed." And I love that, because that just applies to, you know, we can only see what we can see or what we deny, you know, we don't want to see, but then more gets revealed in this whole process. And I mean, even terms of just an evolving, you know, greater powers, greater than myself. And I love that, because I don't think symbols are static either. You know, that we're always half of something and finding the other half as we go along. um, you know, that our understanding isn't complete. So what I'm seeing is a change from an end game to a real process and an opening, you know, in relationships and connecting, and that, you know, another person helps you to find more of yourself as you go along, or more that you want to change. So so I think I was curious if you're seeing, you know, like, I think that's the key, is the openness. Otherwise, it's a closed system. I mean, what do you think, Cody? It's about the system remaining open.
I think you're exactly right. What you reminded me of, Terry, and then someone else too had said something that made me think of this, was that Edinger says that paradox is an affront to the logic of consciousness, and that paradoxes always point to the self, right? And the thing with a paradox is that you can't really, it's not meant to be understood. It's actually meant, it's the opposite, right? It's not necessarily meant to be misunderstood, but that it doesn't make, it doesn't make sense, right? And so I think that the more comfortable we get, or the more open-minded we are to living in a paradox, is that's going to really open the door, because the unconscious is presenting itself in paradoxical language all the time. The language of paradox is the language of symbolism. And so I really like what you're saying here. Like, a lot of the images that we saw today on these alchemical plates they're paradoxical images, right? You know, the virgin birth, for example, is a paradox. You know, God becoming a human is a paradox. Sober alcoholic is a paradox, right? Clean drug addict is another paradox. So yeah, so I appreciate that. So yes.
Thanks, Cody. Question from the chat. What do you mean by our darkness? Is that the dark side of our nature, character? Do you believe we all have a darkness in us?
Yeah, I love this question too, because yes, and yes. You know, Jung said that the human being is murky at best, right? Which means we're kind of a mix of light and dark. And I think oftentimes we're we're sort of reluctant to accept both sides of ourselves. On one hand, we are beings of light, right? That the God image is within us, right? But on the other hand, so is the devil. And that the evils that we see in the world are really sort of they exist within us as well to a certain extent, you know, maybe to a lesser degree, but that, you know, that, and so and when I talk about the darkness, you know, it's very interesting because I have experience in my own life as a degenerate, you know, methamphetamine, intravenous using, you know, thieving, conniving, you know, just horrible person by whatever standards. And but the thing is that when I so that what I understand now, and what my dreams really are helping me understand, and even writing this book, and of course the 12 steps, is that my spiritual experience began when I took a plunge into the dark. Wilson says he took a plunge into the dark, right? Joseph Campbell talks about you know, that every journey into the mythical world begins with a descent into the darkness. And so all of the myths talk about this, right? Like Jesus going into the tomb, Moses going into the wilderness, Jesus going into the wilderness, Jonah in the whale, you know, Adam and Eve getting kicked out of the garden. All of these represent our journey into the darkness. So on one hand, we've already taken that journey, right? If we're here, most likely we're in the 12 steps or whatever. And I have to tell you that we are lucky because we've had these really dark experiences. I remember watching a Joseph Campbell video a couple weeks ago, and he says that, you know, that more than meaning, what's important for us is to have the experience, right? And I don't think that necessarily applies to people like me, because I've had those experiences. I've taken the dip. And so what I'm looking for then is meaning behind those dark experiences, and how can I create some meaning with them. I appreciate the way Wilson frames it, that our darkness becomes our greatest asset, so because it becomes useful as we try to help other people. And I think that's true, but I think that's really only half the story, because I think what we uncover by going into the darkness is actually the power to change and to transform. It's just like when you plant a seed, you know, you don't just set the seed on top of the soil. The seed has to go deep into the soil, in the dankness of the soil, where it decomposes, and that's when life sprouts. So in the same way, we're looking for that experience ourselves. You have to decide what the darkness is for you. You may already be experiencing it, you know. You may be called to be dark, you know, like I mean, you know, and that's for everyone to decide for themselves. But what I would say is this: if your soul or your psyche, or there's something in you that just wants to do this one thing that's really, really bad, like I would say go do it, because that's the journey into the darkness that I'm usually talking about. But also, like, we can also say that the darkness is just, you know, it comes out of our dreams, our psyche, you know, our shadow, everything like that. So
Thank you. Sharon.
Yes, Cody, thank you. One of my questions is, some of the symbols we have of higher power, God, they come off imbalanced. And I think what I'm hearing from you is that Jung was trying to balance the symbolism so that it had the light and the dark. Is that correct? And I think we don't have that in the symbolism of Christianity, or sometimes Buddhism, or any of the symbols out there. What we tend to gravitate more toward is the light, and we're not given instruction to balance the light and the dark in the symbolism, correct? I see you nodding.
yeah.
Yeah, I think that's what I got. In fact, I was really, I came to your session today after having heard Rami Shapiro yesterday. And if I took anything away from Shapiro's talk, it was a balance of positive and negative in his idea, his symbolism of a higher power, a God, whatever we're going to call it. So thank you for nodding to that question, you know, that Jung was trying to balance that. And I think that's what I want to do going forward, is to balance the idea of symbolism. So then the next question is, in step 2, Bill Wilson took away any concept or I think a symbol of a higher power, and he said it's of your understanding, correct?
Yeah, except I don't know what you mean by took away. What?
Okay, he would have kind of, I think he was saying, let's not look at it as an entity of what the orthodoxy calls God. You create your understanding of God. And so that maybe gives us the ability to create that. But it also leaves us without a symbol in 12 step, does it not?
Well, I think that that's a great question, because if, higher power is also a metaphor, right? So the higher power is also a symbol. Um, it just is a different, it's just a different symbol. So universal mind is a symbol, the great reality, the objective psyche, the collective unconscious. Honestly, ego is a symbol, self is a symbol, shadow is a symbol.
So
Go ahead.
is there one symbol that you've come across that kind of aligns itself with 12 step, or you're smiling?
No, that I love that question, because I think that, so I haven't found a specific, so
Okay.
universal mind, I feel like for Bill Wilson, that was one that I like. Unsuspected inner resource is one that I like. I also like God consciousness. Um, whether Wilson, so I make this case in the conclusion of my book that it doesn't appear that Wilson ever arrived at this kind of understanding of God as this paradoxical unity the way Jung had done. And that's fine, right? Because what Wilson does do in the big book is he really portrays the two aspects of the psyche in a balanced way. Because on one hand, we have the higher power, but then on the other hand, we have this thing he calls the self, or the alcoholic mind. And so the problem with the Western conventional sort of depiction is that, as you said, it's unbalanced, right? So it's all this figure of light. And what that ends up doing is it just drives our own shadows like deeper and deeper into the unconscious.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So what
Yep.
you're saying is, as if I want to mature in the 12-step process, it's to bring my light and my dark together and become more and more aware of it. I think you've said that throughout your meetings, and you're saying it more clearly as we go forward, right?
100%.
And that's the paradox. The paradox is for me to be willing to take whatever's negative that I can even see, much less the stuff that's buried, and bring it into my awareness, and then hopefully accentuate the light or bring it together. Okay, I get it. I'm getting it more and more. Thank you, Cody. I'm impressed.
Thank you. I'm so glad that you're having fun and looking at it, with through that lens. Like that's really, it really is. We're going to talk a lot about this in the upcoming chapters. The problem of opposites is what Jung called it, and he actually develops a God image in that is a response to that, and that sort of allows us to access those powers in ourselves. So good stuff.
And I practice the steps as a toolkit on what I discover. And this helps me to do that, actually continuing to practice the steps. I inventory what I find. I ask higher power to help me resolve that. I look for better alternatives and ongoing guidance from Justin.
Hello, and thank you, Cody, for such a wonderful presentation. I just wanted to comment on something that I've experienced throughout my own 12-step recovery. At first, I would thank God constantly and tell myself that I love myself. But then those things got kind of muddled over time. Maybe a year later, it was like I found myself saying, God, I love you, and thank you to myself. And it was interesting because it just kind of happened. It wasn't conscious or anything. It just kind of happened where I'd say, thank you, God, and I love you, Justin. And then it just turned to, I love you, God, and thank you, Justin. It's very interesting. Maybe you could elaborate?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I can sort of imagine the same kind of sensation. Like, for example, for me now in my life, like if I don't necessarily engage in prayer the way that I used to, right? That there's, but so for me, prayer now is more of a communion, right, with this sort of the self, right? This kind of transcendent aspect of myself. And so I could see where, if you're sort of, you just may be in communion with the unconscious, that it's just, there's been a shift, right? So yeah, I mean, I think that's how I would relate to that. And I think it's probably a powerful experience. So thanks for sharing.
Thanks. Celia, I just saw your message. You've been trying to raise your hand. I had not seen it. I don't know why. Can you unmute now? I'm trying to invite you to unmute.
Yes, hi.
Hi.
Can you hear?
Yes.
Yes, I'm Celia, and welcome. I'm so I have so many thoughts in my head right now, but I'm also feeling God conscious, totally God conscious, and love and grace. Just from listening to you, I am just um, filling up, so to speak, or just totally in tune with the spirit, me, my soul. I've had some experiences, many, and one that I've had the most recently was fear. I was having a battle in my dream with fear, and fear, quote, is the devil, right? In my symbolism. And I'm thinking, why am I having this? And it was a battle, and it wasn't vicious or anything because I wasn't willing to fight. Before, I had this same dream, but back in the 80s, and I was sleeping with my mother, and she said, "Dear, what is happening to you?" And I told her about my struggle. And my mother was a healer. She literally was a healer. And she just held my hand, um, said a prayer, offered it, and it was bingo. I never had that reoccurring dream again. Now, back to the dream that I've had recently that's connected to that in 1985. I will do my best. Um, it fear, this thing came out of me and it was black. It was a black, dusty cloud. And I faced it. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't afraid. I didn't want to fight. I looked at fear, that darkness that was in me, and I was okay with it. And in my psychic, I was saying, why am I not afraid of fear? I'm trying, Duncan. I really am. And so, okay, so I asked fear to sit down, come in, sit down at the table. And I told fear, I am not afraid of you. And the fear, the dust, the blackness went away. But when that happened, I had told, yes,
Celia, do you have a question? Because we're already over time and
okay.
it's
I
not
just
really a
wanted to
time for a
say
long
that
share. Thank you.
I had total fear neutrality for the first time in my life. It's like I can look at it and I'm not afraid. So what I'm trying to say is all this symbolism, um, it's it's working for me. Um, going to communion and hearing this song
Celia?
of, I just want to know if it's real or because I have so many of them.
If you have a
Yes.
question, please ask a question or
Okay.
stop.
Cody, I'd love to have a conversation with you, but can symbolisms work for people, and people can be happy with them and be in a state of grace and be okay, but still searching. That's my question.
Thank you.
I mean, I think that is the process, is that we are, I mean, unfortunately, we never, I like what Wilson says, we never outgrow fear, right? But our relationship to it does change. And so, and I think that any of the symbolism that we can encounter, whether that's through a church or in our own dreams or whatever, I think that that's really good. And I think it's good to, wrestle with it. So thanks for sharing.
Thank you. Fiona.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, I don't know, it's not exactly a question, but I don't know if you're aware of this book. It's a wonderful picture of William Blake and two angels struggling for the child, the good angel and the dark angel, Dis. It's a wonderful book. And I suppose I was just going to say that when I've been trying to make improvements in my life, and I have nightmares, and they'll be dark figures, like you get in horror films or Halloween films, the men in black, they come for me. And I think this book, I read it a long time ago, but it's a wonderful book. And I believe it's the ego. The ego's frightened to let go of me. Because I've got to follow through. If I'm making big changes, I've got to follow through. So the figures come to hold on to me. So, maybe the battle of the good and the bad. Yeah. So just say that. Any thoughts on that? Thank you.
Thanks, Fiona. Yeah, I think it is. I like William Blake. He was a great artist, and he created his whole kind of mythology. So I love that. Thanks for sharing.
Cody, want to check in with you? We're at 12 minutes past the hour, so
Yeah, let's I'll stop the recording and we can hang out for a few more minutes.
okay.